is a case with a serial killer, false confessions, possible wrongful convictions, sexual assaults, 3 murders. It's a wild ride. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Brian Dugan. Viewer discretion is advised. My dog is coughing. She's fine. Brian Dugan was born on September 23rd, 1956 in Nashua, New Hampshire. He was born to James and Jeanine Dugan, and they had a total of 5 kids. So Brian had 3 brothers and 1 sister. He was the second child. Both parents were very heavy drinkers. Basically, they were alcoholics. But I can't seem to find anywhere if any of that led to any kind of, like, physical abuse on the kids. I don't see anywhere where there was, like, any severe trauma in their actual childhoods, like, from the parents themselves. But Brian had a very, very traumatic and horrific birth. So when his mother Jenny went into labor, the doctor apparently wasn't available. I don't know how this all came to be, but basically Brian was already on his way out. Like, his head was out. And so without the doctors there, allegedly the nurses grabbed the top of his head and shoved him back inside his mother. Like, literally pressed his head and pushed him back in. And then, allegedly, they literally bound her legs together so that he couldn't come out again. What the fudge? So later in Brian's youth, he would experience chronic migraines, or just, he got a lot of headaches, and he would have these, like, spells of vomiting all the time. There were indications of possible learning disabilities, and this all pretty much stemmed back to what they think is how he came into the world, how traumatically he came into the world. He had to take, like, a whole bunch of medications from a very early age, and he did so for numerous years. And those medications probably also caused other complications. When he was just a young boy, he started to already show signs of psychopathy. And his parents would bring him to, various doctors, mainly, therapists and psychiatrists, but also normal doctors. And apparently none of them could look at him and see his symptoms and go, yeah, this is what's wrong with him. They couldn't figure it out, I guess. None of these doctors could figure out what to do with this young boy. And by golly, I sure wish they tried, because when he was 8 years old, he and his brother, they burned down the family garage. They were just really interested in fire, and they wanted to see what it did. And apparently when they burned down the garage, Brian loved it. He thought it was enjoyable. Uh-oh, red flag. Then, later down the road, like a couple years later, he would experiment again with fire, but this time with the family cat. Him and his brother poured gasoline on the cat and lit it on fire. So, by 1972, Brian would just pick up and leave. He basically ran away from home. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing or where he was going. And he ran away to Iowa. While he was in Iowa, he would commit several crimes. This would be stuff like burglary, home invasions, grand theft auto. He would also commit acts of assault on people. He had charges of battery. He also had more charges relating to arson. He loved fire. He would actually spend a small chunk of time in a jail cell for all of these offenses. And then when he was done serving his time, he moved back to his family's house in Illinois. When he got back home, he was pretty quickly placed inside this, youth home, and he was put in there with his brother Stephen. According to his brother Stephen, While in this youth home together, allegedly, Brian tried to molest his own brother, but apparently he failed. Stephen also thinks that Brian himself was molested by other, teenage boys there in the home, but again, that's just allegedly. In 1974, Brian abducted a 10-year-old child. He did so from a train station, and he kidnapped this little girl with the full intent to sexually assault her, and from there, who knows what else he would have done. Thankfully, he was caught there at the train station, so he didn't do anything else to that poor little girl. For reasons I can't seem to find, they pressed charges against him, but then quickly the charges were all dropped for this. I don't know why. Just a year after this, in 1975, Brian shows more signs of potential concerning red flag violence when he threatened to murder his sister. Actually, he tried to murder his sister, and then he threatened to kill his sister's son, his nephew. He said, "I will chop him up into little pieces." And then he completely just ruined his sister's car. I can't, again, see if he served any time for these actions, but I do know that in 1979, he was placed in the Menard Correctional Facility, and he was there from 1979 until 1982. Pictured here was Donna Schnorr. She was born on March 30th, 1957 in DeKalb, Illinois. Unfortunately, I can't really find much information on her past. She was considered a very beloved daughter, and just a well-loved family member in general. By 1984, she was a nurse at the Mercy Center Hospital in Aurora, Illinois. On July 15th, 1984, she had attended a party over at a friend's house, and the party had then ended sometime late in the evening, and so she got into her car, said her goodbyes to her friends, and then she left. At some point while driving down Randall Road, it's believed that she stopped at a stoplight, and then a man pulled up next to her. And then when the light turned green, the man then went to the lane where she was and went behind her and then tried to drive her off the road. Then he got to the side of her and sideswiped her, and then she did drive off the road. And then from there, he literally just forces her out of the vehicle. He then found this embankment where he dragged her down the embankment, and then he proceeded to sexually assault her. Where this occurred, there was a quarry. So he drug her down there, and he forced her head in the water, and he drowned her until she was dead. And then he just left her there. Didn't do anything. He just let her sit there. And her body was found a few hours later. The man who did this was Brian Dugan, but he wouldn't be caught for it until a little while later. On May 6th, 1985, Brian Dugan would then attempt to kidnap a 21-year-old woman. Her name was Sharon Grajek, and she lived in Aurora, Illinois. Brian forced her to a secluded location where he then proceeded to sexually assault her. But then she got away afterwards. I don't know if he let her go or if she escaped him. On May 28th, 1985, Brian was just out and about, and he saw a 19-year-old woman walking by herself down a road. This, too, was in Aurora, Illinois. In this situation, Brian tried to grab her, but she was quick to react, and she, dodged him, and then she managed to bolt, and she escaped without any harm coming to her. Her name has been kept private. The very next evening, he saw a 16-year-old girl, also unnamed, kind of in a similar situation, walking on her own, and then he just grabbed her. He managed to sexually assault her, but then she too got away from him. Pictured here was Melissa Ackerman. Melissa was born on June 12, 1977 in Sandwich, Illinois. Sadly, I don't really have much information on her either, and that's probably because she was a very young child. She didn't really get to have much of a life, so there were no experiences for me to share. On June 2nd, 1985, the 8-year-old girl was out riding a bike with her friend Opal. This, I guess, was in Somonauk, Illinois. All of a sudden, a man got out of a blue AMC Gremlin and approached the two girls, and this grown man asked these two 8-year-old kids for directions to somewhere. The girls, not really, this is the 80s, and kids weren't as aware of this stuff as they are now. But they approached him, and as they did, this man, he grabbed Opal by the arm, and then he threw her into the front passenger seat and slammed the door. She tried to get out immediately, but he had the child lock on. As she's struggling to get out, he then grabs Melissa, and he begins to walk around the vehicle to the driver's side. While that's going on, Opal has the great idea, actually, to roll down the window, because the other window wouldn't roll down, but she rolled down the driver's side window, and she jumped out of the window and kind of landed on this man who was holding her friend. The man stumbled, but managed to hold on to Melissa, and Opal just took off running and screaming and went to get help immediately. By the time help came, the vehicle was gone. Melissa was gone. Police were called immediately, and of course, they put the search on for this 8-year-old girl right away, and they searched everywhere for her. But, in that initial search that day, they didn't find anything. 15 days after she was kidnapped, and this would have been just 5 days after her 9th birthday, police would find her body. Melissa had been sexually assaulted, and she was drowned in a creek that was kind of off the road. Now, the day the police were called about all of this, before the day of the kidnapping, Opal had given a description of his vehicle. She gave a description of the man. They came up with a composite drawing of this man, and they dispersed it amongst, the media. The very next day after Melissa was kidnapped, police would actually arrest Brian Dugan. This was because he had expired tags on his plates, and the police had told him about this numerous times, so they finally said, all right, we're just going to arrest you for this. When they then realized the description of the vehicle that Opal saw and the description of the man, both had very similar looks to Brian Dugan and his car. So police were able to search his vehicle, and they found items inside his car that belonged to Melissa Ackerman. So he was then held, for more questioning, at this point for a possible kidnapping. Once they found Melissa's body, they then charged him with murder, kidnapping, and also sexual assault, and attempted kidnapping and attempted murder for Opal. Brian Dugan wanted to avoid the death penalty. He was adamant that he did not get the death penalty. He would confess to Melissa's kidnapping and murder. He then told police, if I confess to another murder, will you guys agree to take the death penalty off the table? They agreed, and he took a plea deal. He then confessed to the murder of Donna Schnorr. Police would ask him, why did you do this? What's the reason? He said, let me read his quote, "It might have been for the sex, but I don't understand why. I wish I knew why I did a lot of things, but I don't." And that's it. That's his quote. That's what he said. Because of the plea deal, Brian Dugan was then sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. And that is it for this case. I hope you found it interesting. Just kidding. There's more. Let's talk about Jeanine Nicarico. Jeanine Nicarico was born on July 7th, 1972. She was born in Naperville, Illinois. She was also considered a very beloved daughter, a wonderful friend to everyone. She had 2 sisters who she considered her best friends. Her family described her as a bright-eyed little girl with an endearing, dimpled smile, and she had a very caring and loving heart. She was actually one of the few kids who loved going to school. She loved reading. She loved horses and dogs. She loved to do gardening, and she loved to bake, with her mom. She loved to like invent games with her own rules to play with friends and her sisters. On February 25th, 1983, Jeanine was actually staying home from school because she unfortunately had the flu. Her parents had to work and her siblings had gone to school, of course. At some point in the kind of like early afternoon, her mom had her lunch break, so her mom came home. Jeanine was there. This was like around 12 o'clock. She was in bed and she made, Jeanine lunch, and then she went back to work. And then the mom said she called the house sometime around 3 or so in the afternoon. Jeanine answered. They had a quick conversation. They said, "I love you," and that was it. Not too soon after Jeanine last spoke to her mom, her two sisters had gotten home from school sometime between 3:30 and 4 p.m. When they walked up to their house, though, they noticed the front door was like swung open and there was what looked like a boot impression on the door, and the door jamb itself was broken. So it looked like someone had kicked their door in. So the sisters very hesitantly went inside. They were calling for Jeanine and possibly even like the parents because, they didn't know. And they went around the house. They searched. They went to Jeanine's bedroom. She wasn't there. Jeanine was gone. They quickly put two and two together and said, oh my God, Jeanine must have been kidnapped. So police were quickly called. The parents got there as quickly as they could. Police found two more boot impressions in the dirt just outside the house. Those boot impressions were the same ones that were left on the door. Police also learned that a bed sheet and another blanket were both also missing from the home, but nothing else was really missing. So it didn't appear to be, the motive did not appear to be like robbery. It appeared the motive was specifically to kidnap this child. Police go into looking into like the family. Do they have enemies? Who would have done this? And they really didn't have much time to investigate that aspect because just 2 days after Jeanine vanished from her home and about 2 miles from where her house was at a park, the body of Jeanine would be discovered. She had been sexually assaulted and she was beaten to death. And then whoever did this left their DNA, their bodily fluid, on Jeanine. So the police collected that bodily fluid, even though they really couldn't do much with it back in 1983. They collected it and they stored it because you never know. They then put out a $10,000 reward and say, anyone who has information, please come forward and you could possibly claim this money. So someone did. A man by the name of Rolando Cruz would go to police and say he knows what happened to the little girl. He said, my friends, I think, did this. Specifically, he would name Alejandro Hernandez and Stephen Buckley. On March 8th, 1984, the three men would all be arrested and questioned. Police would claim that Stephen Buckley had a boot they found in his home that they said matched the boot prints found at the house. But they didn't say it matched conclusively. They said, similar enough, close enough. It's probably the same boots. But other than that, there was no other physical evidence to connect any of these three men to the crime scene. And even the boot prints weren't even a conclusive match. So they really had nothing. All they had was this really basic confession from this Rolando Cruz person, based solely on these very inconsistent confessions and also witness statements from police informants. They would charge all three men with kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. It needs to be noted that the lead detective of this case, he did not feel the three men were responsible for this at all. He knew and he saw there was no physical evidence connecting these men to this case. There was nothing. And he said it was very clear, it was very obvious that they just wanted the $10,000 reward, so they came in and made up some false confession to get the money. That's what they did. But the prosecutor was like, no, we're going to go ahead and go forward with the case. Yeah. So the lead detective, he resigned in protest to all of it. All three men went to trial. And all three men, at this point, are professing their innocence. They're saying, we made this up to get the money. We didn't actually have anything to do with this. But the sheriff's department and the prosecutors were all like, no, we got stuff on you. You're going away for this. And they're like, we didn't do this, we swear. So the prosecution, using just the statements from these men that they themselves claimed were wrong and false and that they admit they lied about, and then the testimony of a couple of police informants. So Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez, they were both found guilty of all charges, and they were both sentenced to death with no physical evidence connecting them to this thing. None. They got the death penalty. Stephen Buckley, the jury couldn't decide whether he was guilty or not, so his case ended in a hung jury, and then the prosecutors just dropped charges against him. They never went after him again. Then both Cruz and Hernandez would have these insane back and forths with convictions being overturned, and then they were tried again, they were convicted, then they were sentenced to life in prison, and then they were sentenced back to death, and it was just like this whirlwind of judicial nonsense with these two men. But ultimately, by 1995, both Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez were both formally released from prison, and all charges were dropped against them. This was because there was more than enough evidence to prosecutorial misconduct. The initial investigation was completely, it was a hot mess. Oh, and also because of one other thing. This video isn't about Rolando Cruz and his friends. Remember, this video is about Brian Dugan. You see, when Brian Dugan was arrested in 1985 and he said, okay, I will confess to this other murder in order to not get the death penalty, well, he actually wanted to confess to 2 other murders. Not only the Donna Schnorr murder, but he also wanted to confess to the Jeanine Nicarico murder. But police said, we already have the guys who did it. They've confessed. They're gonna go to trial. They're gonna go away for a long time. But Brian was like, I can clear their names by saying I'm the one who did it. Like, what are you guys doing? I'm telling you I did it. They're like, no, stop. You stop it, you silly goose. So he eventually was like, okay, fine. And they went forward and all this shit happened. And so yeah, he only like sort of confessed to Jeanine's murder. And then by the end of it, he's like, fuck it. No, never mind. I rescind everything I said about it. Now, by 1995, 1996, after the shit show that was the trials of Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez, they were all cleared and they were released and, they were good to go. So then 7 public officials, 3 people from the prosecutor's office, and 4 sheriff's deputies were all put on trial for their attempt to frame the 2 men for the murder of Jeanine. But, shocker, all 7 people were found not guilty and they were all let go. So yeah, that's the shit that happens here. So, between 1996 and 2005, there was literally no one in jail for the murder of Jeanine. There was no suspects. There was nothing. They were just like, oh well. So, in 2005, they decide, I can't remember who initiated it, but hey, let's test the DNA we found at Jeanine's crime scene. Let's test it against Brian Dugan since he did kind of confess to it all those years ago. Guess what? It was a match. 100%. The DNA left on the murdered body of Jeanine belonged to Brian Dugan, the man who confessed to it back in 1985. So Dugan would plead guilty to her murder. And they're like, fuck you, we're sentencing you to death. And they did. They gave him the death penalty for it. But, lucky him, in 2011, Illinois abolished the death penalty. So his conviction, his death sentence was then overturned, and so he was given a life sentence again. So he was then serving 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. I can't help but wonder what the lives of Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez and even Stephen Buckley would have been like for that, 10-ish years that they were in and out of the prison system for something they didn't do. I get it. It was very, very stupid to go into the police to try to collect the reward money. Very dumb idea. But police should have been better. They should have known better. Let's be real. Those men never should have spent a day in prison. But they did. Not to mention the fact that Jeanine's family could have gotten closure way back in 1985, like genuine closure. But they had to be dragged through this complete nightmare of the legal process with all of these retrials and overturning convictions and getting the death penalty, not getting the death penalty. Like, they had to go through this trauma so much. And they didn't get their actual closure until 2005. 20 years after the murder of their daughter. More than 20 years after the murder of their young daughter. Unfortunately, it happened a lot back then, and this kind of thing still happens to this very day. So, but that is officially the end of this case. I hope you found it interesting. I'm not sure if any of you had actually heard of this case before. If not, hey, you've learned something new. Woohoo! As usual, if you want to see much more content from me, but in much shorter form, like 3-minute videos, if you head on over to my TikTok, I have well over 2,000 cases over there. And you can binge through it if you want. I've got about 2.7 million followers over there. Hi guys, please come over to YouTube as well. Thank you. Okay. So yeah, go over there, give me a follow if you like, and enjoy. Secondly, if you have a case you want me to cover, as usual, please go down to the link tree in my description below. Go to my crimerer case list, scroll through it. You can search, if you go on a computer and put Control F, you can search for the name. If you're on a phone, hit the 3 dots, and then do find and replace, search for the name. If the name does not come up, then you can email me at mikey@truecrimerer.com, which is also in the description below. Just send me the case, the name of the victims or the killer or both, when it happened and where it happened, and then I can make sure it's added to my list. I have 4,200 plus names on there. I pick these cases at random, so please be patient. It could be next week you see your story, or it could be 3 years from now. Just please be patient. I will get to it. And then lastly, if you've taken notice of the Owl Did It shirt, you can purchase this shirt in our merch store, which is also in the link tree in my description below. We also sell shirts with just Making a True Crimerer on it in black and also in gray. You can do rainbow font for some of them. Some of the shirts you can actually customize a word or two. We also sell a wine glass. We sell mugs, other little things. And yeah, so hoodies. So hoodies, everyone loves hoodies. It's getting into the cold season finally. So, all right. Well, that's it. Okay. Until next time, you're out of order. What?